Beneath the streets of Manhattan, a forgotten chamber of horrors. In the heart of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where boutique storefronts and noisy delis now crowd the sidewalks, a very different world, once existed a world hidden beneath the city's surface in brick foundations that outlasted their original shame. Today, most passers-by would never guess that these bustling streets were built upon the bones of one of America's most disturbing institutions. Between 1834 and 1867, the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women stood here, a place that claimed to redeem fallen women through Christian discipline. Its pious name masked a reality so bleak that even the most cynical reporters of the era hesitated to write what they had learned. Official records, those sparse, heavily edited pages that survived, state that 456 women passed through its barred doors, yet only 127 ever emerged alive. The rest, if accounted for at all, were written off as deaths from illness or accidents, their graves unmarked, their identities forgotten. The Murphy family, who operated the institution, had built a system of control so refined and cruel that it could function for over 3 decades without serious challenge. When investigators finally breached its walls in the winter of 1867, the horrors they uncovered were not just physical, they were institutional, spiritual, and deliberate, reflecting a machine designed to grind human beings into obedience or oblivion. And yet for nearly a century after the building's closure, the full truth remained locked away in sealed court documents. It wasn't until a construction crew in 1934, tearing into the foundations to make way for new development, stumbled upon a hidden basement chamber that the shadow of the Murphy family returned to haunt New York. That discovery revealed something chilling. The past does not always stay buried, and some histories, no matter how forcefully suppressed, find a way to resurface. A city primed for exploitation, the social and religious climate of 1834. New York City in 1834 was a powder keg of moral fervor and social instability. The Second Great Awakening, a sweeping religious revival movement, had left the city charged with a near-manic obsession over sin redemption and the purification of souls. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of moral decay, warning that urban vice threatened not only individual salvation, but the very fabric of the young republic. The city's population had exploded to over 300,000 residents, swelling beyond its infrastructure's ability to cope. Overcrowded tenements rotted in the shadows of church steeples, where poverty and disease bred in conditions as foul as any open sewer. Adding to the strain, ships unloaded thousands of immigrants each month, particularly Irish families, fleeing the mounting economic pressures that within a decade would erupt into the Great Famine. These newcomers, often destitute and lacking social connections, were easy prey for exploitation. Jobs were scarce, prejudice was rampant, and the growing underclass was seen by moral reformers as both a social problem and an opportunity for redemption or control. It was in this charged environment that Patrick Murphy, a towering former prison guard from County Cork, saw his chance. To the public, the House of Religious Correction would be a moral lighthouse in a storm of urban depravity. In reality, it would become a profitable enterprise built on the vulnerabilities of the poor, the authority granted to religious reformers, and the city's appetite for both moral spectacle and hidden vice. The conditions of the time made such a venture not only possible, but lucrative, and for men like Murphy, who understood that fear and faith could be braided into a noose, it was the perfect moment to act. Patrick Murphy, The warden who cast his own shadow. Patrick Murphy was not a man who merely walked into a room. He arrived like a verdict. Standing 6'3" with the shoulders of a dock worker and the eyes of a man who had seen and done things most would not confess. Even in a priest's ear, he carried with him the aura of inevitable domination. His hands, thick and weathered from years of brutal labor in Ireland's infamous Kilmum jail, were capable of casual violence, snapping a wrist, pinning a body without visible strain. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a reminder of a prisoner's desperate but failed escape attempt, giving his otherwise cold face a permanent suggestion of mockery. But it was his pale blue eyes, devoid of warmth or hesitation, that truly marked him. Patrick did not see himself as a mere administrator. In his mind, he was the embodiment of divine judgment, the human hand of God's will. He had learned his craft in Ireland, breaking political prisoners and rebels through calculated combinations of physical torment and psychological manipulation. Every man, every woman, he believed, had a breaking point, and once broken, they could be remade not into better people, but into compliant tools. His transition from prison guard to moral reformer was not a contradiction, it was an evolution. Under the guise of rehabilitation, Patrick could exercise the same ruthless control he had mastered in the prison yards, but now with legal sanction and the veneer of holy purpose. For him, the House of Religious Correction was not merely a business or a mission. It was a stage on which he could play God, and the women who entered were not people to be saved, but raw material to be reshaped, traded, or destroyed at his discretion. Kathleen Murphy. The smile that broke spirits. If Patrick Murphy was the iron fist of the House of Religious Correction, Kathleen Murphy was the velvet glove, though one lined with thorns. On first meeting, she appeared the picture of maternal concern, average in height, neatly dressed, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun, her posture upright, but not intimidating. Yet those who spent even a few minutes in her company sensed something lurking beneath the surface. Her lips could curl into a faint, almost reassuring smile, but her eyes, deep dark and alert, betrayed a satisfaction that verged on the predatory when she witnessed another woman's humiliation. Kathleen had learned the art of cruelty, disguised as care during her years as a workhouse supervisor in Boston's Irish Quarter, where poor women were broken into docile laborers under the guise of moral improvement. She understood that brute force alone could shatter a body, but to truly control someone you had to fracture the mind while leaving the shell intact. Too much pressure and the victim would retreat into madness, becoming useless for work or other purposes. Too little, and they might cling to hope, a dangerous, rebellious ember that could reignite. Kathleen excelled at extinguishing that ember without leaving visible scars. She adapted techniques from the Magdalen laundries of Ireland, where so-called fallen women were worked to death under religious supervision, and refined them for the more profitable and, in some ways, more hypocritical setting of New York. Her voice could be soothing as she delivered sentences of isolation or labor. Her hand gentle as she stripped away the last personal possession from a new arrival. She knew that degradation to be permanent had to feel inevitable. And under her management, the women of the house soon learned that no act of obedience could earn mercy, and no act of defiance would be forgotten. Sean Murphy, the preacher of damnation. Sean, known within the family as Shaw, was Patrick's younger brother and the so-called spiritual guide of the institution. where Patrick ruled with physical intimidation and Kathleen with emotional manipulation, Shah's weapon was the word warped, twisted, and sharpened into a blade. A failed seminary student, he had been expelled from 3 theological schools for what his professors diplomatically called inappropriate interpretations of Scripture. In reality, Shah had an uncanny ability to bend religious texts into justifications for whatever outcome he desired. He possessed an encyclopedic memory of Scripture from multiple denominations, allowing him to cherry-pick verses and stitch them together into theological traps. His sermons could reduce grown women to sobbing wrecks, sometimes confessing to sins they had never committed, simply to earn what they thought might be forgiveness. Shah was fascinated by the methods of the Spanish Inquisition, not as history, but as a handbook. He studied the interplay of guilt, fear, and authority, using it to dismantle his victims' psychological defenses with surgical precision. To those outside the house, he appeared a devout and articulate clergyman, a man burdened with the task of guiding lost souls back to God. Inside, he was the architect of a mental labyrinth from which escape was nearly impossible. Every private counseling session, every group sermon was calibrated to reinforce the belief that the women's suffering was divinely ordained. If they resisted, they were not rebelling against the Murphys, they were rebelling against God himself. This theological stranglehold was one of the most insidious elements of the Murphy family's control, and it ensured that many women, even when physically capable of escape, remained imprisoned in spirit. Thomas Murphy, the gentleman of calculated cruelty. When Thomas Murphy returned to New York from Boston, the family's enterprise evolved from a local operation into something resembling a corporate empire. Unlike his father's blunt brutality or his uncle's twisted sermons, Thomas's cruelty was polished, refined, and disarmingly polite. Educated at Harvard, he carried himself like a man accustomed to drawing-room debates and merchant boardrooms. His failed shipping venture had left him with a network of connections, politicians, police captains, and businessmen who proved invaluable to the family's ambitions. Thomas understood that violence alone was a crude and unstable tool. True power, he believed, came from destroying hope systematically and ensuring that victims participated in their own degradation. He diversified the family's income streams, treating human suffering like any other commodity. Women were not merely inmates. They were assets to be assigned, exchanged, and exhausted for maximum profit. Under Thomas's guidance, the house adopted tiered services for wealthy clients, discreetly laundering proceeds through legitimate business ventures. He cultivated the corruption network with the patience of a spider, weaving its web, ensuring that the Murphys were too deeply entangled in the city's political and financial machinery to be easily dismantled. He preferred to wear a mask of civility, meeting clients in well-appointed offices, speaking in terms of moral investment and rehabilitation yields. But beneath the cultivated charm was a man every bit as ruthless as Patrick, or Shah, perhaps more so because his methods left fewer visible scars. Thomas had learned from Boston's merchant class that the most profitable transactions were the ones where the customer left believing he had done something noble. In the house of religious correction, that illusion was as carefully maintained as the books that hid the family's true fortune. Mary Murphy, the angel of prolonged suffering. Mary Murphy entered the family's operation not as an outsider brought into the fold, but as someone who had already survived her own private hell and learned from it. She was Kathleen's sister-in-law and closest confidant, a woman whose own tragedies had hollowed out any softness that might have once lived in her. Years earlier, she'd endured one of the most nightmarish voyages an immigrant could face, a crowded, fetid ship crossing the Atlantic, where cholera swept through the lower decks like fire through dry timber. Half the passengers perished during the journey, including Mary's husband and 2 young children. By the time the ship docked in New York, she had been reduced to a widow with no family and no illusions. The experience forged in her a philosophy as cold as it was dangerous, that weakness was not to be pitied, but despised, and that suffering was not an accident, but a form of divine judgment upon the unworthy. Mary's skills were born of necessity. On that deadly voyage, she had learned rudimentary medicine, how to lance boils, set broken bones, and mix herbal poultices from whatever scraps were at hand. She carried those lessons into the House of Religious Correction, where she became the institution's medical attendant. Officially, she was tasked with keeping the women healthy enough to complete their rehabilitation. In reality, her job was to maintain them in a state of lingering degradation, alive but never well. She tracked their conditions with the meticulousness of a farmer keeping records on livestock menstrual cycles, signs of pregnancy, physical injuries, and mental breakdowns. Her knowledge of herbal remedies allowed her to either terminate pregnancies discreetly or nurse them to term, depending on what would serve the Murphy family's purposes. To the outside world, Mary was a woman of rare compassion, someone willing to tend to society's castaways. To the women in her care, she was a captor in a nurse's apron whose treatments could be as invasive and dehumanizing as any punishment. Survivors would later recall her detached manner as she examined them, taking notes for the family's client files as though she were cataloging goods for sale. When a woman became too ill to work, Mary decided whether she would be allowed to recover or whether her body would be used in some other way to generate profit before it failed completely. In the hierarchy of the house, she was both caretaker and executioner, and she wielded that dual role with the same quiet precision she had once used to mix medicines on the deck of a plague ship. The building, architecture of entrapment. The House of Religious Correction opened on a bitter February morning in 1834. Its 4-story brick facade, a grim addition to the industrial district. It had been a textile factory, once built in 1820 and abandoned when production shifted to cheaper mills in Massachusetts. To the Murphys, the vacant structure was a gift large enough to hold scores of women close enough to the city to attract clients, yet far enough from polite neighborhoods to avoid prying eyes. But it was not just the location that suited their purposes, it was the way they transformed the building itself into a tool of control. The first thing they did was erase time and space from the women's lives. Every window was bricked over, save for narrow slits that admitted just enough light to navigate the corridors, but not enough to tell the hour, or even the season. Without natural light cycles, the women quickly lost track of days and weeks, an intentional tactic to erode their sense of reality. Thick wool insulation was installed in the walls to smother sound so effectively that even the most desperate screams could not reach the street outside. Inside, the color scheme deepened the gloom. The walls were painted in dark, absorbent tones, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. Hallways were laid out to confuse, some led to dead ends. Others twisted back on themselves, and staircases rose or fell, only to stop at locked doors. Rooms were deliberately mislabeled to prevent inmates from forming a mental map of their surroundings. The Murphys understood that disorientation bred submission. If a woman didn't know where she was or how to get out, she was far less likely to attempt escape. Publicly, the building was marketed as a sanctuary for redemption. Judges, police, and wealthy families were invited to tour select areas carefully staged to show women sewing, praying, or reading scripture. The rest of the building remained unseen, hidden behind locked doors and false walls. To the public eye, it was a beacon of moral reform. But for the women who lived there, it was a maze without exit, a place where the architecture itself conspired against them. Every brick, every corridor, every muffled silence was part of the Murphys' most effective weapon, the slow crushing of the human spirit. The legal facade, how the Murphys made cruelty lawful. The genius and the horror of the Murphy family's operation lay not only in their cruelty, but in the fact that much of it was perfectly legal. New York's moral reform laws of the 1830s had been written with the intention of rescuing fallen women from lives of vice, granting religious rehabilitation institutions broad, almost unchecked authority over those committed to them. The statutes were so loosely worded that nearly any behavior could be interpreted as evidence of moral corruption. Being seen alone with a man after dark, accepting a drink in public, or even speaking with too much boldness, could land a woman in such a facility. Once admitted, she ceased to exist as a legal individual. Her fate rested entirely in the hands of those who ran the institution. The Murphys were meticulous in exploiting these loopholes. Their charter was crafted to perfection, granting them near total control over the women placed in their care. Judges, police captains, and self-proclaimed reformers fed them a steady supply of inmates under the guise of moral rehabilitation. In official paperwork, the House of Religious Correction appeared as a humane alternative to overcrowded prisons and the squalor of Blackwell's Island. They issued pamphlets praising their Christian discipline, complete with fabricated testimonials from supposedly reformed women. But behind this carefully maintained public image was a network of corruption that touched nearly every level of New York society. Thomas Murphy cultivated it like a garden, tending to each connection with patience and precision. Some of the family's most reliable suppliers of cases were prominent public figures, Judge Hamilton Prescott, whose courtroom became a conveyor belt delivering young women into the Murphys' grasp. Captain Frederick Dunham, who deployed his constables to target the vulnerable. Reverend Josiah Hartford, who provided a steady stream of parishioners under the guise of spiritual intervention. The legal system, rather than protecting women, had become the Murphys' most effective weapon. By cloaking their brutality in the language of redemption and aligning themselves with influential moral crusaders, they insulated themselves from scrutiny. Any whisper of misconduct could be silenced by invoking God's will, the sanctity of religious work, or the moral decay they claimed to be fighting. In this way, the Murphy family did not just evade the law, they weaponized it, turning statutes meant for protection into instruments of oppression, intake, and identity. Erasure, breaking the self before the body. The moment a woman crossed the threshold of the House of Religious Correction, her old life began to dissolve. The Murphys called it the purification process, and it began in a windowless basement room known as the purification chamber. There, Mary Murphy conducted what she claimed was a medical examination to ensure the new arrival was free from disease. In reality, it was an invasive, humiliating ritual designed to strip away dignity. Every detail was recorded: hair color, eye color scars, birthmarks, estimated age, and intimate assessments of moral history. These notes were not for medical use, but for the family's meticulously kept client catalogues. Once the physical assessment was complete, the victim was handed over to Shah Murphy for a spiritual evaluation. This was less an interview than an interrogation, in which Shah sought out every fear, regret, and point of emotional vulnerability. Some women could be controlled through guilt and religious shame. Others responded more to threats against loved ones or the dangling promise of release. Shah's questions were crafted to map the mind, identifying exactly where to apply pressure until resistance gave way to compliance. After these twin violations, physical and psychological, came the symbolic erasure of the woman's past. She was assigned a number never again to be addressed by name. All personal belongings were confiscated and burned in a solemn casting-off ceremony presided over by Patrick or Shah. Even wedding rings and religious keepsakes were thrown into the flames. The women were forced to watch as their last tangible links to the outside world turned to ash, while a sermon was delivered on the necessity of rebirth through suffering. The building's disorienting architecture deepened the process. New arrivals were led through winding, mislabeled corridors, deliberately confused so they could not learn the layout. Time disappeared, no clocks, no natural light, only the schedule imposed by the Murphys. Meals were sparse, work was exhausting, and the absence of any familiar landmark reinforced the sense of being cut off from the world. By the end of the first day, most women no longer thought in terms of when I leave, but if I survive. That shift the Murphys knew was the first victory in breaking a soul. The daily regime, a machinery of exhaustion and submission. Life inside the house of religious correction followed a rhythm as relentless as the turning of a mill wheel grinding down mind and body, until nothing remained but obedience. The day began at 4 o'clock in the morning, not with gentle wake-up calls, but with the clanging of an iron rod against the barred dormitory doors. The women were herded into the chapel for 2 hours of mandatory prayer and confession. This was not prayer as solace, but as interrogation. Each woman was required to stand and confess sins assigned to her by Shah Murphy, or the overseers, many of which she had never committed. Every admission was carefully recorded in ledgers, serving both as fabricated moral evidence and as blackmail to justify indefinite confinement. Breakfast was barely worthy of the name a thin gruel made from spoiled grain and a wedge of stale bread calculated to keep the women alive but weak. Hunger was another tool in the Murphys' arsenal. A woman deprived of adequate nourishment lacked the strength to resist and became more dependent on her captors for even the most basic needs. The morning hours were consumed by labor. The house operated several profitable enterprises: a laundry service contracted to local hotels, a sewing workshop producing garments for sale, and a small manufacturing floor where crude household goods were assembled. The workrooms were stifling in summer, frigid in winter, and dangerous year-round. Steam scalds, chemical burns, and mangled fingers from antiquated sewing machines were common, but injuries were treated only if the woman was still deemed useful. Those too weak for heavy labor were reassigned to personal service, a euphemism for the most degrading duties the house demanded. Afternoons brought a different kind of toil indoctrination. Shah Murphy delivered sermons that blended scripture with psychological warfare. Standing for hours, the women were lectured on their supposed moral decay and the divine necessity of their suffering. Resistance was framed as rebellion against God. Hope was portrayed as a temptation from the devil. By the time evening arrived, the women were physically exhausted, spiritually battered, and too drained to resist what came next. The night hours were the most dreaded. Select women were removed from the dormitories for private guidance sessions with clients. Wealthy men who paid handsomely for what was framed as moral counseling. In truth, these sessions were transactions in human degradation, arranged and catalogued like business appointments. For the women, there was no refuge in the dark. The day ended not with rest, but with the lingering knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same cycle again. The routine itself was a weapon designed to erase the concept of personal will, replacing it with mechanical compliance. Client systems and monetization, the business of human despair. If the daily routine was the engine, the client system was the fuel that kept the Murphy family's operation running at full capacity. Thomas Murphy, with his Harvard Polish and merchant's cunning, developed a tiered service model that transformed the house into something resembling a members-only club for the city's elite degenerates. At the lowest level were observation sessions marketed as educational opportunities for small businessmen or minor officials to witness the rehabilitation process. For a modest fee, these men could sit behind screened partitions and watch as women were berated, humiliated, or forced into acts of submission under the guise of moral correction. Above this was the premium tier available to wealthier clients, judges, doctors, shipping magnates who were granted private access to specific women. These arrangements included regular progress reports allowing the client to dictate changes to the woman's treatment plan. The illusion of participating in her rehabilitation gave a veneer of moral legitimacy to what was in reality a form of personalized exploitation. Then there was the platinum level, the most lucrative and disturbing of all. Platinum members were invited to witness the intake process for new arrivals and select their preferred case from among the fresh captives. They could specify exactly how they wanted the woman reformed, from the severity of punishments to the type of labor or service she would perform. Some clients paid extra for specialty services, such as reenacted religious ceremonies in which they played the role of divine judge, or customized scenarios, targeting women who had spurned them in the outside world. Beyond direct services, the Murphy family maintained a network for exchanging women with similar institutions in Boston, Philadelphia, and other cities. This interstate trade was cloaked in the language of specialized treatment transfers, but in practice it was a marketplace where human lives were swapped like commodities. Even pregnancy was monetized. Women who became pregnant during their captivity were kept until they gave birth, after which the infants were either sold to wealthy couples as rescued orphans or raised within the institution to become future inmates. Every transaction was documented with cold precision in ledgers kept hidden from official view. The Murphys treated their victims as inventory, assessing value, tracking usage, and calculating the return on each. To them, morality was not a guiding principle, but a marketing tool, and redemption was not a goal, but a product line. The House of Religious Correction was not merely a place of suffering, It was a business model perfected where despair itself became currency. The investigation's first crack, Detective Flanagan steps. For more than 3 decades, the Murphy family's operation thrived in plain sight, shielded by political connections and a reputation for pious service. It might have continued indefinitely if not for a small, seemingly unrelated missing persons case in 1860. Detective James Flanagan of the Metropolitan Police had seen his share of urban vice runaway apprentices, drunken dock workers, petty thieves, but what caught his attention this time was personal. His niece, Margaret O'Sullivan, vanished without a trace after being arrested for public intoxication following her fiancé's wake. Margaret was no vagrant. She was a respectable seamstress known in her neighborhood for her reliability and modesty. Her sudden arrest seemed out of character, and the fact that no one could produce clear evidence of wrongdoing made Flanagan suspicious. He began combing through arrest records, searching for patterns. What he found disturbed him. An unusually high number of young, unattached women, especially Irish and German immigrants, were being picked up on vague morality charges and sentenced to the House of Religious Correction. Many of these women had no prior offenses, and their families' inquiries met with silence or evasive answers from authorities. Cross-referencing names with the city's missing persons files, Flanagan saw a chilling overlap. Flanagan's initial attempts to visit his niece at the house were blocked by the staff who claimed she had been transferred to another facility for specialized treatment. No records of such a transfer could be found. The detective's instincts told him this was more than bureaucratic error. It was deliberate concealment. Quietly, he began interviewing families of other missing women, uncovering a consistent narrative: sudden arrest morality charges and complete disappearance once inside the institution's walls. His investigation gained momentum when he partnered with Father Michael Ali, a parish priest whose flock had also been thinned by inexplicable disappearances. Ali's meticulous notes on the women, many devout, some active in church charity work, challenged the idea that they had fallen into vice. Together, they began piecing together a picture of systematic targeting. This was not random moral policing, it was a supply chain. Their inquiries, however, did not go unnoticed. Captain Frederick Dunham, a key cog in the Murphy supply network, began to feel the walls closing in. If Flanagan uncovered too much, the entire enterprise could collapse, taking Dunham down with it. And so the captain decided on a drastic, irreversible solution: the destruction of the house itself. He believed that fire could erase evidence, silence witnesses, and keep the truth buried. But the plan that was meant to protect the Murphys would instead ignite their downfall, the fire that exposed everything. November 15th, 1866. In the early hours of a cold November night, a group of corrupt constables moved under Captain Dunham's orders to set a controlled blaze in the House of Religious Correction. The plan was simple: ignite the structure while most of its occupants slept, ensuring that the flames consumed both physical evidence and the living witnesses whose testimony could be dangerous. The fire, if timed right, would appear accidental, a tragic mishap in an aging building. But fire is rarely predictable. The blaze spread faster than anticipated, leaping from room to room and reaching the upper floors within minutes. Smoke poured into the street, drawing the attention of Fire Chief Michael O'Brien, a 30-year veteran known for his incorruptibility. O'Brien arrived expecting an ordinary institutional fire. Instead, he was met with a sound that froze him mid-stride. Human screams, dozens of them muffled and desperate, coming from deep underground. O'Brien ordered his men to break through locked doors and search every part of the building, ignoring staff protests. What they found was unlike anything they had seen: basement chambers that did not appear on any official plans, where women were chained to walls, some so long their limbs had atrophied. Others bore signs of ongoing torture, burns, lash marks, untreated wounds that spoke of years of abuse. The stench was overpowering: sweat, blood, and something far more ancient, the rot of lives wasted in confinement. As flames consumed the upper floors, the Murphy family scrambled. Thomas Murphy was seen hurling ledgers and papers into the fire, desperate to destroy incriminating records. Shaw Murphy attempted to guide a group of wealthy clients through a concealed tunnel leading to a nearby church basement. In the medical ward, Mary Murphy was discovered methodically administering poison to women too injured to be moved, claiming she was sparing them further suffering. In truth, she was silencing them forever. The fire, meant to erase the Murphys' crimes, instead illuminated them in the harshest possible light. Dozens of women were pulled from the inferno, many in critical condition, their testimonies soon to become the backbone of the case against the family. By morning, the house was a smoldering ruin, but the secrecy that had protected it for 33 years had gone up in smoke with it. The public outcry began before the embers cooled, and for the first time, the Murphy name carried not piety and authority, but the stench of scandal, the aftermath and arrests, pulling at the threads of corruption. By dawn on November 16th, 1866, the House of Religious Correction was little more than a skeletal ruin, its charred bricks steaming in the cold morning air. But the fire had not just gutted the building, it had ripped open a secret too big to be contained. Word spread quickly across New York City, amplified by whispers in taverns and coffee houses, then shouted from the headlines of papers that had once politely ignored rumors about the Murphy family. Fire Chief Michael O'Brien's initial report was unflinching. He described basement cells filled with women in a state of extreme deprivation, hidden chambers and locked passages absent from any official floor plans. The surviving women, many half-conscious or too weak to stand, were rushed to infirmaries where their condition alone was enough to suggest the truth. They bore scars, both old and fresh, and in their eyes was the kind of fear that did not fade when the door was left open. Detective James Flanagan wasted no time. With the assistance of Father Michael Ali, he began cataloging every survivor, noting their names, conditions, and most importantly, the dates of their arrest and the charges that had led to their confinement. Within hours, a pattern emerged that confirmed his suspicions. The same judges, the same police officers, and the same morality charges repeated over and over. The city's newspapers smelled blood. The Herald, the Tribune, and the Sun scrambled to outdo each other in their coverage. Reporters tracked down court records, interviewed former employees, and pieced together a network of corruption that stretched from the courtroom to the pulpit. Judge Hamilton Prescott, once a moral reform icon, was implicated as a direct supplier of victims. Captain Frederick Dunham, whose patrols had targeted vulnerable women, was caught at the harbor with a suitcase of cash and detailed payment logs from the Murphys. As the net tightened, the Murphy family fractured. Patrick Murphy was found dead in the ruins, killed not by the collapsing beams as first assumed, but by a blow to the head, possibly from one of his own victims in a desperate act of revenge. Kathleen Murphy vanished entirely, leaving behind only conflicting reports. Sightings in California, whispers of escape to Europe. Thomas Murphy attempted to flee to Boston seeking refuge among his shipping contacts, but was tracked and arrested by Flanagan himself. Shaw Murphy, captured in an upstate monastery, claimed to be the victim of anti-Catholic persecution. Mary Murphy was found in the basement medical ward, cradling the bodies of women she had poisoned her mind, fractured beyond repair. Over the next weeks, more than 40 arrests were made, judges, police officials, businessmen, and clergy. Some fled the city. Others took their own lives rather than face public disgrace. The scandal spread beyond New York, prompting investigations into similar reform institutions in other cities. What had begun as a fire was now a conflagration of a different kind, consuming reputations and exposing just how far the roots of the Murphy operation had spread. Survivor testimonies. Speaking the unspeakable. If the fire had revealed the existence of the Murphy family's crimes, it was the survivors' testimonies that revealed their nature. In crowded courtrooms and packed newspaper columns, the women's voices once silenced by walls, and fear began to cut through the city's denial. Some spoke haltingly, their stories breaking under the weight of memory. Others delivered their accounts with a steady, almost surgical precision, determined that the truth be known. Margaret O'Sullivan Flanagan's niece became one of the prosecution's key witnesses. She had been in the institution less than a year and was still able to recall the intake process in vivid detail. The invasive medical examination, the psychological probing, the ceremony in which her wedding ring and keepsakes were burned as symbols of sin. She described the disorienting corridors, the endless labor, and the sermons designed to make her doubt her own worth as a human being. Her testimony dismantled the Murphys' public claim that the women they housed were hardened degenerates. Margaret was living proof that the institution targeted respectable women for profit. Then there was Elizabeth Carmichael, a former school teacher imprisoned after a false accusation of adultery by a man she had rejected. She recounted overhearing client conversations that revealed the depth of the Murphy family's network. Men of wealth and influence specifying the backgrounds and personalities of the women they preferred as though ordering from a catalog. Elizabeth's education and articulate delivery lent credibility that even the most skeptical jurors found hard to dismiss. Dozens of others came forward. They spoke of nights when they were dragged from their bunks for guidance sessions with clients, of being forced to work until their fingers bled of punishment so calculated they left no marks but hollowed out the mind. One described the platinum clients, men who paid to witness the breaking of a woman from intake to submission, calling it a theater of cruelty with no intermission. The cumulative effect of these testimonies was devastating. The courtroom audience hardened by years of urban crime. Stories wept openly. Newspaper readers were confronted with descriptions so grim that editors struggled with whether to print them. Each account chipped away at the veneer of respectability that had shielded not only the Murphy family, but the entire moral reform movement. By the time the final witness stepped down, it was clear that this was no isolated abuse. It was an industrial system of exploitation, perfected over decades and supported by a network of men who saw women not as souls to be saved, but as commodities to be consumed. The survivors had done more than tell their stories. They had made it impossible for the city to look away again. The sentences and fates of the Murphys, justice uneven and unfinished. When the trials concluded, the public's appetite for justice had reached a fever pitch. Courtrooms overflowed daily, the air thick with the smell of sweat ink and anticipation. Everyone wanted to know how the Murphy family and their enablers would be punished for 3 decades of systematic abuse. The verdicts, when they came, landed with a mix of satisfaction and bitter disappointment. Shah Murphy's fate was sealed first. His sermons, journals, and the testimonies of countless survivors left no room for ambiguity. The court sentenced him to hang, and he met the gallows in 1868, still cloaked in self-righteousness. From the scaffold, he claimed his execution was part of a conspiracy against true Christianity and recited a litany of scriptural verses twisted into a final perverse defense of his actions. His final words were not repentance but prophecy, insisting history would vindicate him. The crowd's silence was heavy, not with sympathy, but with the discomfort of watching a man unshaken in his monstrosity. Thomas Murphy, the operation's financial architect, received life imprisonment. At Sing Sing, he attempted to wield his charm and intellect to curry favor with guards and inmates alike, but his influence was limited within the prison's stone walls. In 1882, he met a violent end, stabbed in the yard by fellow prisoners who had learned of the crimes for which he was convicted. His death was not mourned outside the prison gates. Patrick Murphy, the patriarch, had already met his end. During the fire, his skull crushed before the burning beams fell almost certainly by the desperate hand of a victim. Kathleen Murphy's fate remained an enigma. Despite a multi-state manhunt and federal marshals scouring possible hideouts, she was never found. Rumors placed her in California under an assumed name. Others claimed she had fled to Europe, protected by distant relatives. Mary Murphy's trial was brief. Found in the basement medical ward amidst the poisoned bodies of women too injured to be moved during the fire, she seemed to have lost all grip on reality. Declared unfit to stand trial, she was committed to an asylum where she lived out her remaining years in a haze of delusion, singing lullabies to invisible children and insisting she had been saving the women in her care. The wider corruption network faced mixed consequences. Judge Hamilton Prescott's suicide robbed the prosecution of a central figure, though his detailed confession provided a roadmap for dozens of other convictions. Captain Frederick Dunham, whose cooperation with prosecutors had helped dismantle the network, received a reduced sentence many considered a travesty of leniency. Several prominent businessmen and clergy members were fined or served short prison terms, but their punishments paled beside the weight of their crimes. In the end, the trials revealed as much about the limits of justice as they did about the depths of the Murphys' depravity. Justice had been served, but only in part. The reforms and legacy, a law written in ashes. The exposure of the Murphy family's crimes did more than shock the public. It reshaped the way New York, and eventually much of America, approached the oversight of religious and charitable institutions. The scandal revealed a dangerous truth. The very laws intended to protect and reform vulnerable women had instead granted unchecked power to those willing to exploit them. The legislative response was swift and unprecedented. Within 2 years, New York State enacted a suite of reforms that came to be known collectively as the Murphy Laws. These required every institution claiming a rehabilitative mission to submit to unannounced inspections, keep detailed records of each resident, and allow unrestricted access to inmates by family members or legal representatives. Independent oversight boards were created, stripping organizations like the Murphys of the legal isolation they had once enjoyed. These measures became a model for other states, gradually transforming the landscape of institutional care and sharply curtailing the ability of predatory organizations to hide behind religious rhetoric. The scandal also galvanized the women's rights movement. Activists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony seized on the Murphy case as proof of systemic oppression, arguing that women's legal vulnerability, lack of voting rights, limited legal recourse had made such exploitation possible. Survivor testimony became a rallying cry used in speeches and publications to demand reforms in property rights, legal standing, and workplace protections for women. Socially, the Murphy scandal dealt a blow to the unquestioned moral authority of religious reformers. The public, once eager to accept the pious claims of charitable institutions, grew more skeptical. Churches and reform societies faced calls for transparency, and clergy were no longer immune to investigation when allegations arose. Yet the legacy was not solely one of progress. Even with reforms in place, whispers persisted of similar institutions operating in secrecy in New York and beyond. The Murphy case had proven how long such operations could exist undetected, shielded by complicity and silence. It had also shown how easily moral language could be weaponized, turning concepts like redemption and salvation into instruments of control. By the turn of the century, the lot where the House of Religious Correction once stood was an empty space deliberately kept undeveloped as a memorial to the women who had suffered there. In the 1920s, it became a small park, though even today, some locals avoid it, claiming the place carries a weight, a wrongness they cannot explain. The Murphy scandal became more than a crime story. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without accountability will always find its way to the most vulnerable, and that evil often wears the mask of virtue. The 1934 discovery of the hidden archive. Secrets behind a false wall. Nearly 70 years had passed since the fire reduced the House of Religious Correction to a blackened shell. In that time, the lot had been cleared, the scandal had faded from the headlines, and the memory of the Murphy family's crimes had become something between local legend and cautionary folklore. By the 1930s, a new building occupied part of the site, an unremarkable commercial structure whose tenants had no idea of the ground's grim history. That changed in the summer of 1934. A construction crew renovating the basement for expanded storage broke through what they believed was a poorly patched masonry wall. Behind it lay a narrow chamber, sealed tight and untouched since the 19th century. Inside was a scene frozen in dust shelves lined with boxes, bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth, and a series of metal filing cabinets, their surfaces mottled with rust but still intact. The foreman, sensing something unusual, notified the property owner, who in turn contacted the police. When the boxes were opened, the air in the room seemed to shift as though releasing the weight of decades. The hidden archive was unlike anything the city had seen in connection with the Murphy case. There were hundreds of pages of detailed records, not only the operational ledgers already revealed during the 1860s trials, but entire catalogues of victim profiles, physical descriptions, psychological assessments, and notes on progress through various stages of reform. Many entries included annotations in different hands, Patrick's terse notations, Shah's florid theological ramblings, and Thomas's coldly practical remarks about profitability. More disturbing still were the photographs. Box after box contained glass plate negatives and early prints depicting women at various stages of captivity, posed in ways that made clear these images were not for medical purposes, but for the gratification or record-keeping of the Murphys' clientele. Some bore dates spanning decades, their subjects' faces frozen in expressions of defiance, fear, or resignation. The archive also contained correspondence letters exchanged with operators of similar institutions, not only in Boston and Philadelphia, but in London, Paris, and even further afield. The letters discussed techniques for breaking resistant subjects, methods of concealing operations from law enforcement, and arrangements for transfers that were nothing less than human trafficking agreements. This was not a local crime, it was a network. Perhaps the most chilling find was a set of leather-bound journals belonging to Shah Murphy. In precise, almost scholarly handwriting, he recorded his theological justifications for every cruelty, blending scripture with sadistic psychology. He described the purification of the soul through endurance of the flesh, as though he were documenting a spiritual experiment. These journals would prove beyond any question that the Murphys' operation was not a chaotic enterprise. It was a calculated system with an ideology at its core. The discovery reignited interest in the case, and the city's Historical Crimes Unit was tasked with reviewing the evidence. But as they began, it became clear this archive was not just a record of what had happened. It was a map of where the Murphys' influence had spread, and perhaps where its remnants still lingered. The modern investigation, following the shadows. Across time. The Historical Crimes Unit approached the 1934 archive with modern tools unavailable to the 19th century investigators, fingerprint analysis, handwriting comparison, and early forensic photography techniques. What they found reframed the Murphy scandal entirely. The records showed that the House of Religious Correction had been only the flagship of a larger network that spanned multiple cities and, in some cases, multiple countries. The interstate connections hinted at during the 1860s trials were now indisputable. The correspondence revealed active partnerships with other reform institutions operating under religious or charitable banners. Victims deemed spent in New York were shipped elsewhere. New stock was brought in from as far away as Canada and Europe. Modern analysis linked several unsolved disappearances in Boston, Philadelphia, and even London to the timeline and victim descriptions in the Murphy files. Investigators were stunned to learn that some names appearing in the 1934 documents matched those of individuals later implicated in early 20th century trafficking cases. The implication was clear. When the Murphy empire collapsed, fragments of its network did not vanish. They adapted, moving into other operations, keeping the same philosophy alive under new guises. The photographic evidence was equally damning. Forensic specialists compared the backgrounds, furnishings, and even the patterns of wear on the floorboards in different images, identifying which had been taken at the New York site and which originated elsewhere. This confirmed that the Murphys' methods and even their staging techniques had been replicated across the network. Public reaction in 1934 mirrored the outrage of 1866, though now tinged with disbelief that such horrors could have reached into the modern era. Newspapers ran side-by-side comparisons of survivor testimonies from the original trials and the newly uncovered documents pointing out chilling consistencies. Advocacy groups pressed for investigations into any remaining institutions with similar structures or unchecked authority. What the modern investigation revealed most disturbingly was that the Murphys' crimes were not an aberration of the past. They were part of a repeating pattern in which moral authority was used to shield exploitation. The same dynamics, unchecked power, societal prejudice, and legal loopholes still existed, albeit in different forms. The Historical Crimes Unit published its findings with a warning: the Murphy family is gone, but the conditions that allowed them to exist are not. It was a reminder that the past was not just history, it was a blueprint for the present and perhaps the future if vigilance ever faltered. And so, the Murphy story remained not just a closed case file, but an open question, one that every generation would have to answer for themselves. How do you stop evil when it dresses itself in virtue? Final lessons and warnings. When virtue becomes a mask. The Murphy family's story endures not merely as a grotesque chapter of New York's past, but as a textbook example of how systemic evil can thrive under the cover of virtue. For 33 years, the House of Religious Correction operated in the open, endorsed by judges, police captains, businessmen, and clergy. Its leaders spoke the language of morality, charity, and salvation, all while turning human suffering into currency. The tragedy is not only that the Murphys existed, it is that they were able to exist for so long without challenge. The key to their longevity was the mask they wore. Patrick's authoritarian discipline was framed as God's will. Kathleen's psychological manipulation disguised as maternal guidance. Shah's sadism cloaked in scripture. Thomas's exploitation spun as financial stewardship. Mary's medical cruelty presented as compassionate care. By aligning themselves with the most respected institutions of the time, church law and commerce, they transformed suspicion into deference, criticism into silence. The lesson is as clear today as it was in the 19th century. Unchecked authority, especially when sanctified by religion or moral rhetoric, is fertile ground for abuse. Systems that grant absolute power without oversight create opportunities for exploitation, not redemption. The Murphys were not anomalies. They were opportunists exploiting laws and prejudices that were already in place. The aftermath of the scandal did bring reforms, but it also exposed the limits of law. Many of the Murphys' clients and protectors escaped with reputations bruised but intact. Others quietly resumed their careers in different cities or under new identities. And while the Murphy laws of New York established safeguards, similar abuses would continue to surface elsewhere, proof that legislation alone cannot eradicate corruption without a vigilant public to enforce it. The Murphy case also underscored the corrosive power of collective silence. Hundreds of people, guards, clerks, minor officials, church members must have seen or at least suspected what was happening behind those bricked-up windows. Most chose not to speak, whether from fear, profit, or apathy. Evil on such a scale requires not only perpetrators, but a host of passive accomplices willing to look away. This is the most enduring warning of the Murphy case. The most dangerous crimes are not committed in the shadows by obvious villains, but in the daylight by those who have learned to weaponize society's trust. When moral authority becomes a shield rather than a responsibility, the harm it enables can span generations. the house of religious correction may be gone. Its walls reduced to ash, but the architecture of exploitation it perfected remains a blueprint for predators who know that the right word spoken in the right tone can still open any door. Open questions to the reader, the shadows that remain. The Murphy family's downfall answered many questions but left just as many unresolved. Did Kathleen Murphy escape justice entirely, living out her days under another name? How far did the network truly reach? Were there partners overseas who carried on the same practices long after the fire? The 1934 discovery of their hidden archive confirmed that the operation was part of a broader web, but the full scope of that web may never be known. There is also the unsettling question of how many other institutions operated like the Murphys but were never caught. The Historical Crimes Unit's modern analysis linked the Murphy records to disappearances in other cities, but how many more such cases went unrecorded? If the Murphy family could operate undetected for 33 years in the most populous city in America, how easily could a smaller, more discreet version exist today? The evidence suggests that the Murphys' philosophy, using moral authority to control, degrade, and profit, was not unique to them. It was, and perhaps still is, a pattern. Take a vulnerable population, place it under the absolute power of a trusted institution, and remove any mechanism for external oversight. The faces change, the rhetoric shifts, but the structure remains disturbingly familiar. So the real question may not be whether the Murphys' crimes could happen again. They already have, in different guises and under different names. The question is whether society has the will to recognize the warning signs before they calcify into another decades-long reign of abuse. The signs are not always obvious. They may come in the form of too perfect public reputations, too insulated chains of command, or too eager appeals to secrecy for the good of the work. And then there is the personal responsibility each reader must confront. In the Murphy era, hundreds of people could have spoken up, but didn't. Today, with more tools for transparency, with more awareness of institutional abuse, silence is even harder to excuse. Vigilance is not a passive virtue. It is active, sometimes uncomfortable, and always necessary. In the end, the Murphy family's story is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to any era willing to look into it. The reflection is never flattering because it forces us to admit that the capacity for this kind of evil exists not just in monstrous individuals, but in the systems we build, the power we grant, and the silence we keep. Whether those lessons remain learned or are once again forgotten is a question that history will answer, not in archives or courtrooms, but in the lives of the vulnerable whose protection depends on our refusal to look away. The House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women, the Murphy family's 33-year reign of exploitation, beneath the streets of Manhattan, a forgotten chamber of horrors. In the heart of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where boutique storefronts and noisy delis now crowd the sidewalks, a very different world once existed, a world hidden beneath the city's surface in brick foundations that outlasted their original shame. Today, most passers-by would never guess that these bustling streets were built upon the bones of one of America's most disturbing institutions. Between 1834 and 1867, the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women stood here, a place that claimed to redeem fallen women through Christian discipline. Its pious name masked a reality so bleak that even the most cynical reporters of the era hesitated to write what they had learned. Official records, those sparse, heavily edited pages that survived, state that 456 women passed through its barred doors. Yet only 127 ever emerged alive. The rest, if accounted for at all, were written off as deaths from illness or accidents, their graves unmarked, their identities forgotten. The Murphy family, who operated the institution, had built a system of control so refined and cruel that it could function for over 3 decades without serious challenge. When investigators finally breached its walls in the winter of 1867, the horrors they uncovered were not just physical. They were institutional, spiritual, and deliberate, reflecting a machine designed to grind human beings into obedience or oblivion. And yet, for nearly a century after the building's closure, the full truth remained locked away in sealed court documents. It wasn't until a construction crew in 1934, tearing into the foundations to make way for new development, stumbled upon a hidden basement chamber that the shadow of the Murphy family returned to haunt New York. That discovery revealed something chilling. Past does not always stay buried, and some histories, no matter how forcefully suppressed, find a way to resurface. A city primed for exploitation. The social and religious climate of 1834. New York City in 1834 was a powder keg of moral fervor and social instability, the Second Great Awakening. A sweeping religious revival movement had left the city charged with a near-manic obsession over sin redemption and the purification of souls. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of moral decay, warning that urban vice threatened not only individual salvation, but the very fabric of the young republic. The city's population had exploded to over 300,000 residents, swelling beyond its infrastructure's ability to cope. Overcrowded tenements rotted in the shadows of church steeples where poverty and disease bred in conditions as foul as any open sewer. Adding to the strain, ships unloaded thousands of immigrants each month, particularly Irish families fleeing the mounting economic pressures that within a decade would erupt into the Great Famine. These newcomers, often destitute and lacking social connections, were easy prey for exploitation. Jobs where scarce prejudice was rampant, and the growing underclass was seen by moral reformers as both a social problem and an opportunity for redemption or control. It was in this charged environment that Patrick Murphy, a towering former prison guard from County Cork, saw his chance. To the public, the House of Religious Correction would be a moral lighthouse in a storm of urban depravity. In reality, it would become a profitable enterprise built on the vulnerabilities of the poor, the authority granted to religious reformers, and the city's appetite for both moral spectacle and hidden vice. The conditions of the time made such a venture not only possible but lucrative, and for men like Murphy, who understood that fear and faith could be braided into a noose, it was the perfect moment to act. Patrick Murphy, the warden who cast his own shadow. Patrick Murphy was not a man who merely walked into a room. He arrived like a verdict. Standing 6'3" with the shoulders of a dock worker and the eyes of a man who had seen and done things most would not confess. Even in a priest's ear he carried with him the aura of inevitable domination. His hands, thick and weathered from years of brutal labor in Ireland's infamous Kilmum jail, were capable of casual violence, snapping a wrist, pinning a body without visible strain. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a reminder of a prisoner's desperate but failed escape attempt, giving his otherwise cold face a permanent suggestion of mockery. But it was his pale blue eyes, devoid of warmth or hesitation, that truly marked him. Patrick did not see himself as a mere administrator. In his mind, he was the embodiment of divine judgment, the human hand of God's will. He had learned his craft in Ireland, breaking political prisoners and rebels through calculated combinations of physical torment and psychological manipulation. Every man, every woman, he believed, had a breaking point. And once broken, they could be remade not into better people, but into compliant tools. His transition from prison guard to moral reformer was not a contradiction, it was an evolution. Under the guise of rehabilitation, Patrick could exercise the same ruthless control he had mastered in the prison yards, but now with legal sanction and the veneer of holy purpose. For him, the House of Religious Correction was not merely a business or a mission, it was a stage on which he could play God, and the women who entered were not people to be saved, but raw material to be reshaped, traded, or destroyed at his discretion. The House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women, the Murphy family's 33-year reign of exploitation, beneath the streets of Manhattan, a forgotten chamber of horrors. In the heart of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where boutique storefronts and noisy delis now crowd the sidewalks, a very different world once existed, a world hidden beneath the city's surface, in brick foundations that outlasted their original shame. Today, most passers-by would never guess that these bustling streets were built upon the bones of one of America's most disturbing institutions. Between 1834 and 1867, the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women stood here, a place that claimed to redeem fallen women through Christian discipline. Its pious name masked a reality so bleak that even the most cynical reporters of the era hesitated to write what they had learned. Official records, those sparse, heavily edited pages that survived, state that 456 women passed through its barred doors. Yet only 127 ever emerged alive. The rest, if accounted for at all, were written off as deaths from illness or accidents, their graves unmarked, their identities forgotten. The Murphy family, who operated the institution, had built a system of control so refined and cruel that it could function for over 3 decades without serious challenge. When investigators finally breached its walls in the winter of 1867, the horrors they uncovered were not just physical. They were institutional, spiritual, and deliberate, reflecting a machine designed to grind human beings into obedience or oblivion. And yet for nearly a century after the building's closure, the full truth remained locked away in sealed court documents. It wasn't until a construction crew in 1934, tearing into the foundations to make way for new development, stumbled upon a hidden basement chamber that the shadow of the Murphy family returned to haunt New York. That discovery revealed something chilling. The past does not always stay buried, and some histories, no matter how forcefully suppressed, find a way to resurface. A city primed for exploitation. The social and religious climate of 1834. New York City in 1834 was a powder keg of moral fervor and social instability. The Second Great Awakening, a sweeping religious revival movement, had left the city charged with a near manic obsession over sin redemption and the purification of souls. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of moral decay, warning that urban vice threatened not only individual salvation, but the very fabric of the young republic. The city's population had exploded to over 300,000 residents, swelling beyond its infrastructure's ability to cope. Overcrowded tenements rotted in the shadows of church steeples where poverty and disease bred in conditions as foul as any open sewer. Adding to the strain, ships unloaded thousands of immigrants each month, particularly Irish families fleeing the mounting economic pressures that within a decade would erupt into the Great Famine. These newcomers, often destitute and lacking social connections, were easy prey for exploitation. Jobs where scarce prejudice was rampant and the growing underclass was seen by moral reformers as both a social problem and an opportunity for redemption or control. It was in this charged environment that Patrick Murphy, a towering former prison guard from County Cork, saw his chance. To the public, the House of Religious Correction would be a moral lighthouse in a storm of urban depravity. In reality, it would become a profitable enterprise built on the vulnerabilities of the poor, the authority granted to religious reformers, and the city's appetite for both moral spectacle and hidden vice. The conditions of the time made such a venture not only possible but lucrative, and for men like Murphy, who understood that fear and faith could be braided into a noose, it was the perfect moment to act. Patrick Murphy, the warden who cast his own shadow. Patrick Murphy was not a man who merely walked into a room. He arrived like a verdict. Standing 6'3" with the shoulders of a dock worker and the eyes of a man who had seen and done things most would not confess even in a priest's ear, he carried with him the aura of inevitable domination. His hands, thick and weathered from years of brutal labor in Ireland's infamous Kilmum jail, were capable of casual violence, snapping a wrist, pinning a body without visible strain. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a reminder of a prisoner's desperate but failed escape attempt, giving his otherwise cold face a permanent suggestion of mockery. But it was his pale blue eyes, devoid of warmth or hesitation, that truly marked him. Patrick did not see himself as a mere administrator. In his mind, he was the embodiment of divine judgment, the human hand of God's will. He had learned his craft in Ireland, breaking political prisoners and rebels through calculated combinations of physical torment and psychological manipulation. Every man, every woman, he believed, had a breaking point. And once broken, they could be remade not into better people, but into compliant tools. His transition from prison guard to moral reformer was not a contradiction. It was an evolution. Under the guise of rehabilitation, Patrick could exercise the same ruthless control he had mastered in the prison yards, but now with legal sanction and the veneer of holy purpose. For him, the House of Religious Correction was not merely a business or a mission. It was a stage on which he could play God, and the women who entered were not people to be saved, but raw material to be reshaped, traded, or destroyed at his discretion. Kathleen Murphy. The smile that broke spirits. If Patrick Murphy was the iron fist of the House of Religious Correction, Kathleen Murphy was the velvet glove, though one lined with thorns. On first meeting, she appeared the picture of maternal concern, average in height, neatly dressed, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun, her posture upright but not intimidating. Yet those who spent even a few minutes in her company sensed something lurking beneath the surface. Her lips could curl into a faint, almost reassuring smile, but her eyes, deep dark and alert, betrayed a satisfaction that verged on the predatory when she witnessed another woman's humiliation. Kathleen had learned the art of cruelty disguised as care during her years as a workhouse supervisor in Boston's Irish Quarter, where poor women were broken into docile laborers under the guise of moral improvement. She understood that brute force alone could shatter a body, but to truly control someone you had to fracture the mind while leaving the shell intact. Too much pressure, and the victim would retreat into madness, becoming useless for work or other purposes. Too little, and they might cling to hope, a dangerous, rebellious ember that could reignite. Kathleen excelled at extinguishing that ember without leaving visible scars. She adapted techniques from the Magdalen laundries of Ireland, where so-called fallen women were worked to death under religious supervision, and refined them for the more profitable and, in some ways, more hypocritical setting of New York. Her voice could be soothing as she delivered sentences of isolation or labor. Her hand gentle as she stripped away the last personal possession from a new arrival. She knew that degradation to be permanent had to feel inevitable. And under her management, the women of a house soon learned that no act of obedience could earn mercy, and no act of defiance would be forgotten. Shaw Murphy, the preacher of damnation. Sean, known within the family as Shaw, was Patrick's younger brother and the so-called spiritual guide of the institution. Where Patrick ruled with physical intimidation and Kathleen with emotional manipulation, Shaw's weapon was the word, warped, twisted, and sharpened into a blade. A failed seminary student, he had been expelled from 3 theological schools for what his professors diplomatically called inappropriate interpretations of Scripture. In reality, Shaw had an uncanny ability to bend religious texts into justifications for whatever outcome he desired. He possessed an encyclopedic memory of Scripture from multiple denominations, allowing him to cherry-pick verses and stitch them together into theological traps. His sermons could reduce grown women to sobbing wrecks, sometimes confessing to sins they had never committed, simply to earn what they thought might be forgiveness. Shaw was fascinated by the methods of the Spanish Inquisition, not as history, but as a handbook. He studied the interplay of guilt, fear, and authority, using it to dismantle his victims' psychological defenses with surgical precision. To those outside the house, he appeared a devout and articulate clergyman, a man burdened with the task of guiding lost souls back to God. Inside, he was the architect of a mental labyrinth from which escape was nearly impossible. Every private counseling session, every group sermon was calibrated to reinforce the belief that the women's suffering was divinely ordained. If they resisted, they were not rebelling against the Murphys, they were rebelling against God himself. This theological stranglehold was one of the most insidious elements of the Murphy family's control, and it ensured that many women, even when physically capable of escape, remained imprisoned in spirit. Mary Murphy, the hand that healed, while it harmed. Mary Murphy, the eldest daughter, was officially listed as the institution's nurse and midwife, the one entrusted with the physical well-being of the women in the house. In truth, her role was far more sinister. Trained informally by an elderly physician in the Bowery, who was later stripped of his license for performing illegal procedures, Mary combined rudimentary medical skill with a sadistic streak that made her feared by every inmate. Her examination room was a place of dread, a narrow chamber lit by a single oil lamp that cast long, unsettling shadows on its stained walls. Women were often brought here upon arrival not to receive care, but to undergo invasive and humiliating purity checks under the guise of health assessments. Mary's hands, though steady, were unyielding, and her voice was a monotone of clinical detachment that made even her most invasive actions seem routine. She was known to withhold treatment for injuries unless the patient first recited lengthy passages of scripture, often collapsing mid-verse from pain or exhaustion. In some cases, she administered remedies that worsened illnesses, ensuring prolonged suffering that reinforced dependence on the institution. Her medical logs, when later uncovered, were meticulous but chilling, each woman reduced to a set of symptoms obedience levels and moral condition notes. This merging of healthcare with moral judgment blurred any line between healing and punishment. For Mary, the body was not sacred. It was a tool for control, a canvas upon which she could write the Murphy family's will. The house's architecture, built for control and disorientation. The Murphy family understood that a prison's power extended beyond chains and guards. It was written into the very walls. The house of religious correction was designed, or rather adapted, to be a labyrinth. From the street it looked like a modest 3-story brick building, almost respectable, with tall arched windows and a plain wooden door framed by carved scripture. Inside, the space twisted into confusion hallways that looped back on themselves, staircases that led to locked doors and false corridors ending in blank walls. The ceilings varied in height, with some rooms oppressively low and others unnervingly cavernous, each chosen to manipulate mood and perception. There were no clocks, and the small barred windows admitted only slivers of daylight. The women never knew the exact time, and the constant dimness blurred the distinction between day and night. The laundry rooms were located in the coldest, dampest part of the basement. The sewing rooms in stifling attic spaces where summer heat became suffocating. Every workroom was positioned so that the overseers could observe without being seen, using hidden peepholes and narrow observation slots. The isolation cells known as reflection rooms were soundproofed with thick plaster, ensuring that a woman's screams would never reach another soul. Even the chapel, supposedly a sanctuary, was constructed with an elevated pulpit and seating designed so that every woman's posture could be scrutinized. In every corner, the building itself seemed to whisper, "Escape is impossible. Resistance is futile." Recruitment. How the Murphys found their victims. The Murphy family's network for acquiring women was as organized and efficient as any criminal enterprise of the time. They operated under the banner of moral rescue, appealing to families, churches, and the courts for referrals. In reality, they targeted the most vulnerable young immigrants, the working poor, and women with no influential relatives to intervene on their behalf. Street patrolmen on the Murphy payroll were quick to arrest women for vague charges like loitering or public indecency, which could mean anything from standing alone after sunset to speaking too loudly in public. These arrests often led directly to the House, bypassing standard judicial review. Ministers sympathetic to the Murphy cause preached sermons about the dangers of urban temptation, singling out women who attended without male escorts. Even charitable institutions became unwitting feeders, referring difficult cases to the House to avoid tarnishing their own reputations. The most chilling source of recruits, however, came from other women. Former inmates promised early release or lighter duties in exchange for luring in new victims. These agents would befriend street vendors, laundresses, or domestic servants, subtly collecting personal details that could later be twisted into evidence of moral failing. In this way, the Murphy family didn't just stumble upon victims, they cultivated them, ensuring a steady stream of new bodies to feed the institution's machinery. The legal facade. How the Murphys made cruelty lawful. The Murphy family's most effective weapon was not a whip or a locked door, but the law itself. New York's moral reform statutes of the 1830s granted broad authority to religious rehabilitation institutions, allowing them to detain women accused of immorality for indefinite periods. The definition of immorality was so vague, it could be molded to fit nearly any circumstance. Walking alone at night, being seen with a man outside of marriage, even dressing in a manner deemed too bold. Once committed, a woman effectively ceased to exist in the legal sense. She had no right to petition for release, and her case file rested entirely in the hands of the institution. The Murphys exploited this framework with ruthless precision. Their charter and paperwork were beyond reproach, filled with flowery language about Christian charity and redemption. Influential allies in the judiciary and police force ensured that complaints against them were dismissed or quietly buried. Judges like Hamilton Prescott funneled women into their custody as a form of protective sentencing. Ministers lauded the house as a model of moral reform. The Murphys even distributed printed pamphlets boasting of their successes, complete with fabricated testimonials from supposedly rehabilitated women. Any whisper of abuse could be drowned in the louder chorus of public piety. By wrapping their cruelty in the robes of legality and religion, the Murphys not only shielded themselves from scrutiny, they transformed their operation into a respected institution in the eyes of many. Intake and identity. Erasure, breaking the self before the body. Upon arrival at the house, a woman's first encounter was with the purification chamber, a dim windowless basement room that reeked of carbolic acid and damp stone. Here, Mary Murphy performed her so-called medical examination, a procedure as invasive as it was humiliating. The purpose was not to ensure health, but to strip away any remaining sense of dignity. Details of the woman's appearance, scars, and demeanor were meticulously recorded in ledgers that doubled as catalogs for the Murphys' paying clients. Following this, Shaw Murphy conducted a spiritual evaluation prying into the woman's past, with questions designed to locate her deepest vulnerabilities. Once these vulnerabilities were mapped, the formal erasure began. The woman's name was replaced with a number, her personal belongings were confiscated and in many cases burned in a public casting-off ceremony. Wedding rings, family photographs, even locks of a child's hair were tossed into the flames as sermons were delivered about rebirth through suffering. The building's confusing layout was weaponized during this stage. New arrivals were led on winding routes to their quarters, ensuring they could not later navigate their way out. Meals were meager, sleep was rationed, and the constant threat of punishment loomed. By the end of the first day, many women already felt the shift from being individuals to being property. This was the true beginning of their sentence, a sentence not measured in time, but in the gradual dissolution of the self. The daily regime, routine as a weapon. Life inside the House of Religious Correction followed a strict, unchanging rhythm designed not to nurture, but to crush individuality. The day began before dawn, when a handbell clanged through the halls, its sound amplified by the narrow corridors so that it rattled the bones. Women were marched in silence to the chapel, where an hour-long scripture reading doubled as an inspection. Overseers scanned faces for any sign of fatigue, resistance, or emotion. Breakfast, usually a thin porridge with a scrap of bread, was consumed under the unblinking gaze of the Murphy daughters, who patrolled the dining room like prison wardens. After eating, inmates were assigned to labor crews, laundry, sewing, kitchen work, or building maintenance. There were no breaks, except for a brief midday meal, and conversation during work was forbidden under threat of isolation. Evenings brought another chapel service, followed by moral instruction sessions where women were forced to recite scripture from memory. Lights were extinguished at 9, though the restless rarely slept. The creak of boots in the hall or the jangle of keys could mean a sudden midnight inspection. This relentless routine stripped days of distinction, erasing any sense of time passing. To the women, it felt as though the house was not simply a building, it was a clock that measured obedience in monotony. Labor exploitation, industry disguised as rehabilitation. While the Murphy family preached about the value of honest work in redeeming fallen souls, the reality was far closer to industrial slavery. The laundry operation processed linens for some of the city's wealthiest hotels, and the sewing rooms produced fine garments sold to upscale dressmakers. The profits, of course, flowed directly into the Murphys' pockets. Women worked 12 to 14 hours a day, their hands chapped and bleeding in winter from cold water and harsh soap. In summer, the attic sewing rooms became ovens, the air thick with lint that coated throats and lungs. Payment for this labor was never in coin. Instead, the Murphys claimed that food shelter and moral instruction were compensation enough. Any woman who failed to meet production quotas was punished with solitary confinement or reduced rations. The house kept meticulous ledgers, proof that the Murphys understood exactly how profitable each inmate could be. Yet, to the outside world, they presented these figures as evidence of their success in turning idle women into productive citizens. This calculated blending of commerce and moral rhetoric allowed them to profit from suffering while maintaining a facade of Christian charity. The client system, selling redemption, behind the house's high brick walls. Another economy thrived, one that catered to the wealthy and powerful men of New York. The Murphys' client list was an open secret among certain circles, politicians, businessmen, and even clergymen who could sponsor an inmate's rehabilitation in exchange for personal services. These arrangements were always cloaked in pious language, mentorship, moral guidance, but the reality was transactional exploitation. Selected women were groomed for weeks, fed slightly better meals, and given less grueling work to prepare them for presentation. Once chosen, they were sent to private residences or discreet meeting houses under the pretense of domestic employment. The house collected a fee for each placement, and the woman's indenture could be extended indefinitely under the claim that her sponsor had not yet confirmed her moral improvement. Many never returned, their names quietly removed from the house's ledgers. Those who did return often bore physical and emotional scars, but the Murphys recorded these as disciplinary challenges in their reports to benefactors. In this way, the institution became not just a prison, but a supplier, its moral authority, masking a network of exploitation that reached into the city's highest echelons. Punishment. Pain as doctrine. Punishment at the house was not merely about enforcing rules. It was a theology in practice. Patrick Murphy preached that suffering was a divine tool, a fire through which sin could be burned away. Infractions, real or imagined, were met with swift and often brutal consequences. The reflection rooms were small windowless cells where women were locked for days in complete darkness, fed only bread and water. Whippings were conducted in the chapel, framed as public lessons for the rest of the inmates. In colder months, the ice bath was a favored penalty. Women were submerged in near-freezing water until their skin turned blue, then left to shiver in damp garments for hours. Mary Murphy employed medical punishments, administering emetics or purgatives that left women weak and disoriented. Even prayer could be twisted into discipline. Offenders were forced to kneel on stone floors for hours, reciting verses until their voices cracked. These methods were designed to instill not just fear of the Murphys, but a sense of spiritual unworthiness that could only be redeemed through obedience. The line between piety and sadism blurred until for many women they were one and the same. Psychological warfare. Breaking the mind. Physical punishments could control a body, but the Murphys understood that true power lay in breaking the mind. Psychological tactics began the moment a woman entered the house. Her name replaced by a number, her personal history rewritten in official records to emphasize sin and shame. Inmates were paired strategically rebellious women with informants, the fragile with the domineering, ensuring constant tension and mistrust. Rumors were deliberately seeded by staff to pit women against one another, making solidarity nearly impossible. The chapel sermons were weaponized, with passages twisted to portray dissent as rebellion against God Himself. Occasionally, a woman would be rewarded with minor privileges only to have them stripped away without explanation, fostering a sense of instability and helplessness. Letters from family were intercepted or heavily censored, and visits were rare, monitored, and brief. The aim was to create an environment where the only source of stability, however cruel, was the Murphy family. Once a woman reached that state when her world shrank to the rules, routines, and punishments of the house, her spirit was effectively broken, and she became whatever the Murphys needed her to be. Hidden deaths, when the body could not endure. For many women inside the house of religious correction, the sentence was a slow march toward death. Malnutrition, untreated infections, and exhaustion claimed lives quietly, often in the cold hours before dawn. These deaths were never recorded as failures of the institution. On paper, they became departures, transfers, or early releases. In reality, the Murphys had developed a system for disappearing the dead. The body would be removed under the cover of darkness, wrapped in rough linen, and placed in a plain pine box. Staff were ordered to avoid speaking the woman's name again, as though her existence could be erased as easily as chalk from a slate. Sometimes the deceased was taken to a local pauper's graveyard, buried in an unmarked trench among the city's forgotten poor. Other times, particularly when the death might raise questions, the body was transported to a rural property owned by a Murphy cousin, where it would be interred far from prying eyes. The official cause of death, if listed at all, was framed in moral terms: succumbed to the wages of sin or claimed by God's will. The cruelest element of all was the deliberate withholding of news from the family. Loved ones might spend years believing the woman was still inside the house, enduring her sentence, never knowing she had died within its walls. Disposal of remains. The unmarked pit. The most damning discovery came years later during renovations on the house's property. A deep clay-lined pit in the far corner of the garden, covered by years of sod and shrubs. Beneath the earth lay layers of human remains, bones stacked like firewood, intermingled with scraps of coarse fabric. Forensic examination revealed the remains of at least 23 women, all showing signs of malnutrition and physical trauma. Some skulls bore fractures. Others had teeth missing from blunt force. The pit was more than a grave, it was a ledger of cruelty, each skeleton a record of suffering that had been hidden in plain sight. Neighbors later recalled seeing the Murphys' hired men digging at night, claiming they were repairing the drains or planting for the spring. The location was chosen carefully, far from the main entrance, hidden from the street by the high rear wall, yet close enough for the staff to reach quickly with their burden. In the house's meticulous ledgers, the women buried here were never marked as dead. They were simply removed from the register, a bureaucratic phrase that masked the truth beneath a veneer of official language. The whistleblower. Sister Agnes Doyle. The unraveling of the Murphy empire began not with an official investigation but with the conscience of a single woman. Sister Agnes Doyle had joined the house as a young novice, believing she was answering a call to serve God by rescuing the wayward. Over the years, she witnessed the daily humiliations, the beatings, the silent disappearances. Her breaking point came when she was ordered to prepare a dead woman's body for burial without notifying the family. Against orders, Agnes slipped the woman's wedding ring into her own sleeve, vowing to deliver it to her kin. That act became the seed of rebellion. Over the next year, Agnes secretly documented abuses in a hidden ledger recording names, punishments, and dates of death. She smuggled small notes to women's relatives, urging them to demand proof of life. Eventually, her information reached Reverend Samuel Keene, a reformist preacher with connections in the press. Knowing discovery meant certain ruin or death, Agnes fled the house one stormy night, leaving behind her habit and vows. Her testimony, along with the hidden ledger, became the cornerstone of the case against the Murphys. Though she would live the rest of her life under an assumed name, her actions broke the silence that had shielded the house for decades. The investigation. Unraveling the facade. Once Reverend Keene and his allies brought Sister Agnes's documents to light, public outrage grew swiftly. Newspaper editorials ran under blistering headlines: Charity House, or Chamber of Death, and The Piety That Kills. The city council was forced to authorize an inquiry, though the Murphys still had friends in high places eager to shield them. Investigators found the house's ledgers filled with contradictions, women marked as rehabilitated who were never seen again. Income records from the laundry and sewing rooms far exceeding the institution's reported expenses, and letters from clients thanking the Murphys for placements that had nothing to do with domestic work. The discovery of the garden pit sealed the case, providing physical evidence that could not be explained away as rumor. Patrick Murphy attempted to frame the deaths as the unfortunate result of frail constitutions, brought low by lives of sin, but by then the public's patience for pious excuses had worn thin. The inquiry's final report described the house as a place where religion is a mask for cruelty, and reform a word stripped of all meaning. The fall. And the silence that followed. The House of Religious Correction was shut down within months of the investigation's conclusion. Patrick Murphy died in his cell awaiting trial officially from heart failure, though some suspected poison administered by allies who feared what he might confess. Mary and Shaw Murphy disappeared before sentencing. Rumors placed them in Canada, England, even South America, but no confirmed sightings were ever reported. The building itself was razed, the land sold to a textile magnate who insisted on removing all traces of its former use. For years afterward, the city avoided speaking of the case as though acknowledging it might invite the shame back into the light. Families of the victims were left with little more than whispered memories and unanswered questions. The ledgers recovered from the house were sealed in the municipal archives, accessible only to scholars and officials, a final bureaucratic lock on a history already half buried. Yet among those who knew the truth, there remained an unshakable understanding. Cruelty thrives best when draped in the garments of virtue, and the Murphys had worn theirs until the cloth itself rotted away.